These states are very important because a lot of people, once they start using stages, get on a mistaken notion that you have to be at a really high stage in order to have access to these deeply spiritual occasions, and you don't. You can be at virtually any stage and have access to these four great states. So gross, subtle, and causal states are ever present. Even an infant wakes, dreams, and sleeps. Even a 4-month-old fetus is being plunged into gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual states. So that's something that every human sentient being comes with, is access to these states and the domains that they come with. Now, the interesting thing about states is that they're not really filled in with a lot of content. And you can just sort of even kind of do a thought experiment about the dream content of young children. And there's been research done on this, but you can imagine the dream content of a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old. And I'll use spiral dynamics for stages just very briefly. A 2-year-old's not going to have orange thoughts or green thoughts or blue thoughts. Those just haven't developed yet. And it's not going to have dreams that have a highly structured linguistic capacity either. If you wake a 6-month-old infant up, it doesn't go, why, yes, by George, I was dreaming of having tea and crumpets the other day. It's not linguistic. The dream, it hasn't been structured yet. But it's still the dream state. We all sort of understand that even a 6-month-old dreaming is in the same similar-ish dream state that we're in. So these great potentials are given to human beings at any stage of development. And that's really important because it plays certainly into therapy, because it means we can draw on these states in a therapeutic way whenever we want. And many of you are already talking about some of the ways that you can actually bring very profound transpersonal moments to bear on a therapeutic situation, no matter where a person is developmentally, and that's very, very important. So part of the problem in the early transpersonal movement is that there was kind of a war between the camps that were looking mostly at states of consciousness, and they were claiming it was all ever present. You can just do holotropic breath work and do this wonderful, and you're getting in touch with everything. And then there were people that were doing stage work, and they were going, you know what? It's not quite that simple. There are stage things that just don't show up and aren't ever present. And so obviously the integral model does both. That's right. So these are very, very important. We want to include both of these things. And we'll come back on how that ties in. So on this, let's now look just very briefly at the stages and talk about those two different types of stages. Because this, again, is why we haven't quite had an integral model until recently, because we just haven't seen enough of these things all put on the table where we can start to pull them together. So the first kind of stage is indeed the kind of stage conception that you do find in the great meditative texts, and you find a lot of them. They are first-person, phenomenal stages of experiential unfolding. And they typically happen in a course of meditation. If you want, probably the very, very best study of this, and it's still a classic, and that's the one that Daniel P. Brown did, and we included it in the book Transformations of Consciousness. He studied over 13 meditative traditions in Tibetan and Sanskrit and Chinese, and showed a similarity in terms of how they report interior experiences unfolding. Now again, these are not rigid rungs or anything like that. They're just waves of experience that tend to unfold in a certain sequence. And classically what happens is, just to use generalized terms, you start in meditation and you sort of deal with gross objects first, and all the obvious things come in, and then you learn how to quiet the mind, and then subtler and subtler perceptions start to emerge, and then you quiet the mind more, and then generally a stream of luminosity, perhaps love, bliss, and so on starts to emerge. And if you keep doing that, you can actually get into unmanifest absorption, those kinds of things. You can look at the 7 interior castles, you can look at St. John of the Cross, you can look at almost any of the great contemplative traditions, and they have stages of meditative unfolding. Again, not in rigid, ladder-like things, but just waves that tend to unfold in a certain sequence. And when you master one set, then another set of experiences tend to occur. So you can find those stages in the meditative traditions. They're very important. We try to take them into account. Even the 10 Zen ox herding pictures is another version of stages of meditation. What you won't find is the second kind of stages, the intersubjective ones that have been pioneered by Western researchers. And there's a couple reasons you won't tend to find it. And one is that they're not available to your first-person introspection. And the reason they're not is that these structures that have been investigated by Piaget or by Jane Loevinger or Claire Graves, spiral dynamics, integral psychology has probably 2 or 3 dozen, the book Integral Psychology, 2 or 3 dozen researchers on these stages. These stages are deduced by looking at groups of people over long periods of time. And I give the example that Carol Gilligan used very quickly. She was looking at female moral development. She had been studying with Lawrence Kohlberg, and Kohlberg had found 3 major stages of moral development that he called pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. We sometimes call them egocentric, ethnocentric, and world-centric. She wanted to see if the same thing worked for women, so she did a pilot study using women. And the moral dilemma that she posed to them had to do with abortion. Does a woman have a right to an abortion? Now, Kohlberg had famously asked these kinds of dilemmas. One of the most famous was, a man is married to a wife who has a lethal terminal illness. There's a medicine that will save her life. Does he have the right to steal the medicine? And Kohlberg found that people gave 3 different responses. The first response was, yes, he has the right to steal the medicine. The second response was, no, he does not have the right to steal the medicine. And the third response was, yes, he has the right to steal the medicine. So you ask, well, okay, why? So the first response, yes, he has the right to steal the medicine because what's right is what I say is right, fuck you. Okay, that's known as pre-conventional. That's egocentric. That's I'm it and that's that. The second response was, no, 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 you can't steal the medicine, even though it could save, somebody's life. Why not? Well, that would be against the law. That's conformist or conventional stage. It's just you can't break the law. That would be horrible. My country, right or wrong. And it's a very, very unself-reflexive. Now, it's a step up from egocentric because it's taking a second-person perspective into account. But it can't get out of the conformity of rules. So, oh, no, breaking the law would be terrible. No, I couldn't steal it. Third response is, yes, you can steal the medicine. Why? Well, because life is worth more than $22. And there's a larger issue involved in this. And so it's a very highly reasoned moral response. And it was noticing that the pre-conventional, the post-conventional almost always gave the same answer. That got me onto the pre-trans fallacy and how often they get confused. But we see it very, very clearly there. Well, Carol Gilligan did ask the same kinds of questions about abortion. She found the same thing, the same 3 stages that women go through. Yes, she has the right to an abortion. No, she doesn't. Yes, she does. And very, very similar reasons. Now, what happens with these those are stages. They never emerge in a sequence that goes the other way. And if you follow this group over time, and you find that somebody gives response 2, and they change their response, it'll always be to response 3, never to response 1. So we have a sequence, we have a stage sequence. Now, those kinds of stage sequences are what you don't find in the meditative or spiritual texts anywhere around the world. So what we want to do, when we're looking at quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, is those 3 things are part of what we're taking into account. We want to take into account states because they're ever present, and they have a lot to do with the eminence issue. We're going to come back to in about 1 minute now. The stage, quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, the levels refers to the stages. We just talked about 2 very important types of stages. And then we come back to types, and we mentioned states as well. So of the 3 things that I've just briefly been discussing, states and 2 types of stages, where can pathology occur? In all of them. Except emptiness, because it has no moving parts and can't break. But everything else in the manifest, anything that is put together can fall apart. And anything in the manifest domain can get out of whack. And if you haven't experienced it yourself, your clients have. You have seen it all. There is not a single thing that can't get broken. Human beings are just that clever. So part of what we want to do then is we want to say, okay, now an overall view of how to help people, including ourselves, is when these pathologies can occur in states, when these pathologies can occur in stages, and what can we do about it? And that's sort of part of what we end up talking about. And so we can come back to that in a little bit. Now, incidentally, in transformations of consciousness, I looked at the types of stages in the self that are the second type we discussed, the intersubjective ones that are researched by Western psychologists in particular. But keep in mind that these things, they all sort of run together. They're not going to be radically separated because we're still dealing with a human being who's going through, going through these things. So whether even the Kohlberg stages of moral development, even if they're not exactly researched just the way Kohlberg or Gilligan did in the meditative texts, you can still find certain kinds of unfoldings that are similar. But we really want to look at both of those two kinds of stages and include those because they're very, very important in an overall model. And like I say, for identifying pathology, and also just for, if y'all did work on memes, for example, on sort of identifying these in yourself, one of the important areas for that's the second type of stage we're talking about. You can sit on your meditation mat forever and you will never be able to identify or spot those unless somebody points them out first based on this other research. But one of the reasons knowing those levels of values, for example, is knowing where your client is and what language you want to use to talk to them in skillful communication. And that's very, very important. Whether the person's going to actually undergo transformation or not, you have to know what wavelength they're on, so you can attune your broadcast to the same wavelength they're on, or they're not going to hear what you're saying. The therapeutic alliance depends upon aligning these wavelengths. That's part of skillful means in any event. And then looking at pathologies as well.